As Al mentioned, one of the things that drives this process from my point of view was becoming a very passionate, motivated, interested learner in various subject matter that I won't go into here today, with pretty wide-ranging interests, and finding that despite being highly motivated and highly interested, that I could be reading along at 1 minute, very engaged, very connected with what was going on, and the next moment, I was gone. I was drifted away. And I really became very, very interested in how does this happen? How is it that people disengage? What is it that causes this disengagement? Because if it happens to somebody who's motivated, then imagine what it must be like for somebody who's kind of on the conveyor belt of education, who's not really motivated, who's just having to go through the hoops. So it occurred to me more and more that this process of disengaging was something that was a key ingredient to understanding how we could develop learning environments that would facilitate the development of people that were more participative in their learning experience. Because if I can't sense that I'm about to disengage and act on it some way, then I'm just some kind of puppet, falling asleep and waking up depending on what's going on in the world. I'm not very participative. So we began the process of saying, well, what is it that causes this disengagement? And this is a model that I use right now to kind of articulate this process. That, for example, as I speak right now, the words that I use, the tones, the shapes, they create a flow of foreground experiencing in you, the listener. And that concurrent to that process, as this is moving, from the background of your experiences, from your own background, your past learning, the background kind of comes up and forms the context with which you perceive the meaning of what I'm saying in the foreground. And these processes move like this. That in order for somebody to learn, the stretch, which is implied in the learning process, kind of presupposes that you've come to the landing together, that you've established enough relevancy, that, for example, before you go off to some entirely new terrain, as a teacher articulating a subject or as an author writing a book, that you've kind of gathered the learner to a point where what they know that's relevant is in mind when you go to make the jump, when you go to move to the next point. Because when you move from what's relevant and what's known to what's new and what's unknown, what you're asking of the learner, without asking for their volitional participation, is you're asking their attention span to bridge that gap, to move from what they knew comfortably through the tensions, potential challenges, and frustrations to some closure about something new that they had not had experienced before. It's that window of attention stretching or spanning from the old into the new, which is the critical attention span in the learning process. Let me say a critical attention span in the learning process. So, for example, as articulated here, again, we have the flow of foreground experiences, the flow of the background kind of coming up to meet it, that as we leave what we might call relevancy ground, or some place where there's some comfort, and we head towards some place which we'll call renewal when, aha, I got that and I can move on again, there's this stretch. The stretch is occurring between the foreground and background, and it's occurring in attention. Now, during that process, right in that critical time frame, every word, term, phrase, particular approach to pacing, style of presentation, conceptual density, cognitive style, sensory bias, all of those things which are implied in this kind of staircase we construct for learners to move across that gap, to the extent that those pieces, those steps in that gap, we intend to be stretches. We understand that the learner doesn't know this, and we're intentionally going to stretch them. Say that that's one class of problem. The real difficulty occurs when words, terms, phrases, presentation styles, conceptual densities, all these issues we've been talking about, aren't necessarily, they're not connected with the stretch, they're connected with the background, connected with building the background. and they don't fit, when they don't work. In other words, here's the learner who's in the critical attention span and encounters a word, term, or phrase which wasn't intended to be the stretch word, term, or phrase. It was intended to just be kind of the scaffolding, okay, that we walk on. Exactly at that point, those become disengagements. Those become opportunities to erode the attention span of the learner and unnecessarily cause them to drop out. And this is happening on a rampant scale. Because of the generalization that occurs in the way that information is presented, the tacit assumption of authors that one size fits all, the problems of a single nervous system like a teacher in a classroom having to come up with some kind of a presentation or articulation which is based on either some model as to how to do it or the confusing input of 30 different nervous systems at once trying to say what they need, that what we end up with is during these critical cycles of attention when this learning process is occurring, we end up with some very generalized staircase causing all kinds of mismatch with the learner's needs to have particular and personal access to what's being meant. We'll come back to this as we proceed because the technology helps get at this point a little bit more as we go on. The main point is that not only is there a criticality with respect to learning style theory and multiple intelligences and learning to learn and all the other things that we were talking about, but the proposition here at the moment and the thing that I want to draw attention to is the thing that's most critical about all this is the micro-time dynamics of somebody's attention. People don't learn except now. People don't learn not now. They learn right now. Second by second movement of their attention is what learning is. And we have all kinds of statistical, probabilistic, bell curve-like ideas about learners and how we can relate to them. But the reality is no bell curve statistical learner exists. The actual learner is a living nervous system whose attention span, whose movement of attention is their learning. And so ultimately, in order to facilitate learning and in order to facilitate a more participative approach to learning, we've got to bring the educational process more into consistency with the learning process in a time scale that we're not even aware of yet.